Welcome to our London region webinar, which this evening is going to be about Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation, and we're very delighted to be able to welcome speakers who work for that organisation. It's going to concentrate very much on the Grand Union Canal in West London. This particular part of London is in West London branch, and so I'd like to ask both Roger Still and Ray to join me on the screen for a moment. Hello, Ray.
Hello.
And hopefully, Roger is the chairman of West London branch, and Ray is the planning officer, and they will be fielding all the questions to the speakers at the end. But I will now ask them to take over so they can introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for attending this evening. We have, as West London branch, the IWA, we've been following the progress of the OPDC, Old Oak Park Royal Development Corporation, and planning process over the last, I would say, three years or so, or rather more. And they have been done a fantastic job, I think, in consulting widely and publicising what they're doing and making contact with us and other interested bodies. We're very pleased, therefore, that they have offered to make this presentation this evening to bring us up to date, to tell us what their planning issues are related to the Grand Union Canal. And I would like to introduce Pete Farnham and Jan Ackenhausen, who are, I'm sure will say a word about themselves and their role, but they're both deeply involved, heavily involved in the planning issues, and we very much look forward to hearing from them. So over to you, Pete. Thank you.
Great, thanks Roger, thanks Ray, thanks Libby, and thanks everybody for giving up your evenings to listen to Jan and me talk a little about what OPDC is doing to support the canal. Jan, do you want to briefly introduce yourself now?
Yes, sure, thanks Pete. My name is Jan Ackenhausen. I'm the principal urban designer at OPDC. I work in the design team. We do a whole range of things, but the key focus of our projects are sort of public realm placemaking projects, and my project in particular focus on the canal in Old Oak and Park Royal.
Great, thank you. And I'm, as Roger said, I'm Pete Farnham. I work in the planning policy team. So I've been busy helping to write the local plan, which is the key planning policy document for OPDC. So what we're going to do now is just provide a bit of a overview in terms of what we're up to. I'm just going to share my screen and you should be able to see that now. I'm going to take you through the planning policy side of things, and then Jan's going to delve into the detail and the projects that he's working on. I see there's a few familiar names, so apologies if you have seen this presentation before, but there's a few new names as well. So I'm going to start from relatively high level aspects. So kicking off with planning policy. So the local plan, this is a document we've been writing for a good few years now. OPDC was set up in 2015, and as soon as we were set up, we started to write our local plan for the area. It's currently in what's called its examination in public, and that's been going on for over a year now. These things do take a little bit of time, but we're progressing through it, and hopefully we'll be adopting it to give it full legal planning status later in 2021. So the local plan contains a variety of policies to support and enhance the Grand Union Canal. We've structured the local plan to be quite spatial, i.e. looks at things geographically. So we have policies which cover the whole of the OPDC area, and then we zoom down into different sections, and we call those sections places there. So, and as you can see from the very start, the canal features on the front cover of the local plan itself, just there tucked in the bottom left-hand corner. So where we start from a very high level is looking at our spatial vision, and that effectively helps to guide land uses in and around the area. And what you can see here is clearly the Grand Union Canal weaving through the surrounding areas and then coming into the OPDC area. That kind of beigey yellowy colour is Park Royal, and Park Royal is London's, one of London's most successful industrial estates. So the canal weaves through that quite a big chunk, and then it comes through to what's going to be a more mixed-use area in Old Oak. That area at the moment is going through, you know, the guidance for it is subject to a little bit of change, but this diagram gives you the general gist of how land uses are going to be functioning over the next 20 years and evolving as well. You can also see some of the existing residential neighbourhoods very close to the canal. There's the Wesley Estate, which is near to the Wesley playing fields, which you might just be able to read the text on that as well. And then we have the Island Triangle, Shaftesbury Gardens and Midland Terrace, which are all very close to the canal itself. So as the canal kind of heads further to the east, it then reaches St Mary Cemetery, so a bit more greener area, it's a conservation area, and then you get to the very well-known Kensal Green Cemetery, so lots of heritage assets there. So as the canal weaves through the OPDC area, there's lots of different characters there, and means we have lots of different policies to help manage and enhance those characters as well. So in terms of land use, we provide policies for sites adjacent to the canal, directly against it, but also we have policies which support a whole range of different land uses on the canal. So different moorings and different types of canal uses as well. So this slide gives you a flavour in terms of the concentration of development activity in the OPDC area, and you can see that there's quite a few chunks where there's development directly adjacent to the canal. So that means we put a lot of thought and time into how development will interact with the canal, both in terms of industrial land uses in Park Royal, but also in terms of the more mixed use residential uses. And this helps us to achieve the Mayor's London Plan targets for the OPDC area. So we have an overarching housing target of 25,500 homes to be delivered, and to make space for 65,000 new jobs across the whole area. So lots of change, but the canal is a real positive attribute and element to the OPDC area to help shape that change. One of the key things which the canal can help do in the area is act as a transport link. So you can see it runs east to west. You'll also see a variety of different coloured arrows in the east of our area, and that shows potential new links. And again, they may shift and change over time, but the canal will stay in place. So we know the canal is used as a key east-west walking and cycling route. We know there's a little bit of tension sometimes between those different uses. So we've been working with stakeholders, getting feedback from communities, and working with Transport for London to understand what we can do to help alleviate some of that tension. One example is working with TfL to deliver new cycleways away from the canal. So this stretch of the canal can be maybe more for more local access points. Off the towpath, we also support water-based transport as well. So water-based freight, and other transportation of different materials. We have Power Day, which is a waste management site in the area, and that has an active wharf, which is used to some extent. The policies in the local plan support additional wharfs to be delivered in and around or along the canal. The canal is also an important open space as well, and the character of it does change as you move east to west. There's some very nice parts of it. There's some parts of the canal which doesn't have much overlooking, so there's not many people around, and sometimes that gives a perception of potentially crime along there. So we have policies which seek to enliven the canal in some places, and some places keep it quite quiet as well to reflect the existing character. You can see on the map there, there's kind of a green ribbon running alongside the canal, and that's a general support for greening along the length of the canal. And where you have bridges crossing, that's support for development which seeks to improve those kind of areas around the bridges, because sometimes they Sometimes they're not very nice. So we have policies to help improve that, maybe through lighting, additional greening, that sort of thing. And then we have a whole range of what we call areas of search, bit of planning jargon there, but that's essentially saying, well, over the next 20 years, we want to deliver larger public green open spaces along the canal. And as our research and evidence evolves, we will start to define those in a bit more detail. So as well as being a transport corridor, as well as being open space, there's also the canal's role as a conservation area. So if you look on this map, this shows all our proposed and existing heritage assets within the OPDC area. The blue of the canal shows existing designated conservation areas that we've inherited from the London Borough of Ealing and the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. And then the kind of purple mauve colour on the western part is in Brent. That currently isn't a conservation area, but our plan is to refresh the whole designation of the canal in heritage terms and designate it as one single conservation area. So that'll provide further information in terms of what's important for its conservation status, and it will also help to further shape development directly adjacent to the canal as well. And you can see, if your screen's big enough, you can see a few kind of pink and purple squares and blobs along the canal. They're our local heritage listings, which were adopted and designated earlier this year. And they range from a little lockkeeper's cottage to the majority of the bridges which cross the canal, alongside 1930s Art Deco industrial heritage as well. So when we bring all those different policies together, looking at all those different attributes, whether it's around land uses, connections, transport, conservation, building heights, massing, new parks, we weave all those together and we have a dedicated place policy for the canal. And this rather cartoony diagrammatic image illustrates what that means specifically for the canal. So we've talked about green spaces, we've talked about heritage assets, and they're pepper potted along this diagram as well. And that aims to bring to life the vision, which is tucked in the bottom left-hand corner of your screens there, which is around helping to shape the character across the OPDC patch, talking about moorings, open spaces, other activities, supporting it being a destination for a variety of uses, and as well kind of helping to balance its role as a biodiversity asset and heritage as well. So this diagram essentially shows the broad aspirations for what we have in the local plan. And then Jan's work is actually bringing this to life and evolving them as well. And should say that Jan's work will then create a bit of a feedback loop, which will feed into future planning policy as well. So Jan's going to carry on with the presentation.
Thanks, Pete. Yes, so that was really useful, I guess, for the context setting. I'm going to talk you through some of the things that are happening on the ground. And I'm sure people who live in the area or visit the area regularly, you probably heard about the Canal placemaking study, which is a strategic document we developed in 2018. 2018, 2019, and which sets out kind of a vision or an ambition actually that we have for the canal for the coming years. And just picking up on where Pete left off, or at least I'm basically going to pick up on lots of things Pete mentioned, but just I don't know if you remember that very early map Pete showed about the different uses, land uses in Park Royal and Old Oak. Well, this is what it actually looks like on the ground. So on the one hand, the canal has these really comfortable spaces, green spaces, public spaces that people are quite cherish quite a lot. There's quite some new development with new public spaces that are quite different in typology, but then there's also quite a lot of stretches that's very industrial, like the image in the middle. And those are three characters that we're actually, there's no judgment in these images. I think they all have their value, and the canal is interesting because it is such a mixed area. The reason why we developed this set of ambitions is actually to make sure that whatever happens to the canal happens within a coherent vision. We want to avoid that the canal gets regenerated in bits and pieces. We want to make sure that we can actually preserve that distinct character, or the different distinct characters the canal has today, and that many people also appreciate. The other reason why we developed this document, and Pete already touched upon that, is to provide further guidance for policy, as well as development and regeneration. So we are in touch with businesses along the canal, as well as developers that are developing along the canal, trying to get them on board of the vision and the ambition that we have for the canal. And maybe the most important thing for this piece of work is that big picture approach that can actually be adopted or picked up by anybody. So we're really keen on involving local community in this, users of the canal, the towpath, and making sure that their voices and their input is actually reflected in this document. And just to give you a bit of context, so the pink blob in the middle of this map is the OPDC area, and the pink and brown stars along the canal, all of these are actually quite major development sites. So the canal is really at the center of quite a lot of regeneration that's happening in London at the moment. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because this put us in a really comfortable or in a really good position or interesting position to kind of learn from things that happened in the past in London. So we started off this piece of work with site visits. Here we are in Camden, if I'm not mistaken, where some Camden officers showed us around in how development along their stretch of the canal has actually changed over the past decades, and the lessons they've learned from planning and regeneration along their stretch of the canal. And that was really interesting for us because London has quite a lot of waterways, and there's a lot of things that have happened, a lot of experimentation that has happened that we can learn from. The document or the study is structured in 3 themes, and this really reflects the structure of the local plan. It was quite important for us that both documents can sort of link back to each other, and that we don't develop something that's completely disconnected from the local plan. So the first theme is leisure. That's everything that has to do with sort of civic activity, bringing people to the canal, creating a safe and comfortable environment that makes people want to come down to the canal. The second theme is all about movement. That can be movement along the canal, can be movement on the canal, and involves houseboats as well as freight. And the third theme is all about ecology. And Pete also mentioned that the canal is this really rich and important ecological corridor. And this is something that we definitely want to encourage in the years to come. And in parallel, we developed 3 approaches, and this was pretty much the outcome of our engagement work, through which people showed us that they were actually quite keen on taking an active role in delivering some of these pieces or some of these ambitions that we have. And that the first approach is caring, and that's all about behavior change. Pete mentioned sort of the user conflicts between cyclists, walkers, and so on along the towpath. There are obviously physical interventions that we can imagine to solve that, but there's also quite a lot that we can do in terms of behavioral change, kind of signaling to people that different people share the same space and making sure that everyone feels responsible. But the same is true for fly tipping, for littering, and so on. So there's quite a lot around caring in that strategy that we developed. Another approach is around nurturing, and that's really protecting what's already there and making sure that it can grow. A lot of that has to do with biodiversity, ecology, the green aspects of the canal. And the third approach to deliver our vision is around enlivening, And that's really all about adding action, or adding, maybe not action, but adding activity to those stretches of the canal that already have the sort of rich civic life, but that just need a tiny push to really become sustainable and this exciting place along the canal. So I'm going to talk you through the 6 sort of big headline ambitions that we have, and I'm going to try to come up with a project that we're actually going to do on the ground. I think I've got one project for each of the ambitions. So the first big headline ambition that we have for the canal is all about lively bridges. And what that means is that we want to focus so activity in those places where people actually have access to the canal, and that's usually along areas where bridges cross the canal, road bridges cross the canal. That's also because it will help us to actually keep other spaces along the canal more quiet. I think a lot of people appreciate those quiet bits along the canal, especially in Park Royal, where it's quite difficult to find quiet spots. So bridges are really the focus point for adding activity and adding that kind of public realm, intense or exciting public realm that would bring people down to the canal. And the image that you see, I don't know if it's very clear. It might be a bit flu. The image that you see is the canal access just across the street from the collective. The building in yellow is the old Network Rail depot, which is still there. And you can see actually all the different text bubbles. They all have a different color and different shape. Well, those actually represent the 3 approaches that I explained in the previous slide. So you can easily find what kind of approach will help us to deliver this, and who would be, or who could be, partners in doing so. And this is actually a project that we are delivering. So we submitted planning, I think last week, to rebuild the access ramp leading down from Old Oak Lane to the canal towpath. And that's all about making access DDA compliant. So anyone actually can use the access ramp and has access to the towpath. And at the same time, creating convenient spaces along that ramp where people can just enjoy the surroundings. The Network Rail depot is not currently included in the proposals for the very simple reason that it's still in use, so we can't actually change anything about that. The second ambition we have for the canal is all about good canal routes, and that might sound really generic, but it's actually quite a difficult stretch of the canal. Lots of people use it to commute into the city, which creates quite a lot of user conflicts, especially in summer. And our ambition is to make sure that the towpath has a minimum width of 2 meters all along the canal in our area, which is also one of the requirements of the quiet way, the TfL quiet way, and this stretch of the towpath is a quiet way. But on the other hand, it's also about ensuring that access to the canal is convenient, is DDA compliant, and making sure that we can actually signal the canal from the road, so people that cross the canal or cross the bridges who can't actually see the canal, because quite a lot of bridges have quite high railings, they actually know that they're crossing a canal and there's something happening underneath. The image you see on this slide is Mary Seacole Gardens and the towpath across the canal from Mary Seacole Gardens. We're not currently working on a project there, but we have the ambition to improve Mary Seacole Gardens and make sure that access in that location is also DDA compliant. I think for the moment there's only a staircase leading down to the canal. The third sort of big headline ambition is a Bojo's Paradise. That sounds easier said than done. But it's actually a very popular area for boaters, in part because East London is quite saturated. The regeneration in East London has created quite a lot of opportunities for boaters, but has also pushed up prices and demand for moorings in East London. So quite a lot of boaters find sort of a bit of an escape from that in Park Royal and Old Oak. We're not going to increase activity on in that sense, but I think what we do want to do is make sure that this boating activity is supported with the necessary infrastructure and facilities, and that can include things such as pump out stations for sewers, bin storage, and any other kind of facilities that ensure that boaters can actually use the area in a convenient way and without interfering or without causing any other conflicts with other users. And the image that you see on this slide is a mock-up of a project that we launched just 2 weeks ago, I think. This is in Harlesden. Some of you might know the Lebanese restaurant and the Grand Union, the Grand Junction Arms, is that it, the pub? There's a patch of green, and we're working with community workspace operators, 3Space and architects. We made that to come up with an exciting program of activities that can, on the one hand, support boaters in the area, but also provide facilities for local community. And a lot of the focus will be around sort of community-led activities. So we're thinking about open access workshops for boaters, cycle repair workshops, those kinds of things. But those are only sort of early ideas. Actually, our consultants are in the process of preparing their outreach and engagement work to make sure that whatever happens on that site is actually something genuinely local and that speaks to the local community in the area. I can share the project website maybe in the chat later on for people who are interested in engaging with this project. The fourth big ambition we have for the canal is all about good industrial edges. If you know the canal a little bit, you probably know that there's quite a lot of dodgy areas where big businesses, big factories turn their backs towards the canal. We want to make sure that businesses kind of rediscover their location and their frontage towards the canal and work with them to rethink the way they present themselves towards the canal. So rethinking the backs of the businesses, making them friendlier, making sure that we can, maybe through greening and other kinds of volunteering with their staff, making sure that we can actually enliven the canal along those industrial edges. We currently don't have any specific projects on that, but there's one project which is related maybe to the next ambition, which is all about the ecology of the canal. The towpath, so the publicly accessible part of the canal is the southern part, which is where the towpath runs. The northern part is largely inaccessible. And that's actually quite an interesting feature because that allows us to make sure that that wildness that has developed over the years in that area can actually be sort of celebrated and improved. So there's a number of stretches along the canal where that wildness is currently interrupted. And we're in the process of starting work with businesses along the northern side of the canal to do a number of planting projects, basically just filling in those gaps to make sure that we have this sort of linear ecological corridor on the northern edge of the canal. And I think what we're quite keen on is also to celebrate that kind of urban ecology and making sure that we can kind of tell that story of that urban ecology. So there are quite a couple of ideas around creating opportunities for schools, for school kids to actually learn about that kind of urban wildness, which is so prevalent along the canal. And the final ambition that we have is all about supporting a thriving canal community and creating opportunities for local businesses and local communities to really engage with the canal and kind of adopt it to be this really great public space that they're also a part of. So that's another project that will kick off in the next couple of months with the Canal and River Trust. We'll be developing a whole program of volunteering activities along the canal. And that will be linked up with existing programs of the Canal and River Trust around towpath adoptions and similar projects where businesses can basically adopt stretches of the towpath and take on the kind of the management of it and really start creating a bit of ownership, public ownership of that stretch of the canal. So that's it really. That's sort of, that was really quick, but I was asked to keep it really short. I think I'm actually slightly over time. But I guess there's time for questions after this.
Thank you very much, Pete and Jan. Very, very interesting. And we've had a number of questions coming in. Perhaps I could start with those, if I may. We had a question from, an early question from Amanda Suter. Pete, Amanda was clearly looking at the slides that you presented and noted that there are some coloured blocks showed on. She described coloured blocks shown on one or more of the plans, and she's curious to know what the different colours mean. And I think the particular area that she's interested in is a brown colour area in the area of Wells House Road. Could you comment on that and clarify?
Yeah, that's fun. That's one of the recommendations from our heritage strategy. So that's a local character area. So similar to a conservation area, it's a kind of a bigger geographic designation that we would look to designate in the future, just to recognise the local heritage.
Fantastic. I hope that answers the question, Amanda. But if not, please feel free to we can clarify.
I follow up with a question that comes from Colin George. He says, Peter's map shows a canal park opposite the Birchwood Reserve and says, with the withdrawal of Car Giant from the project, are there any opportunities on their side of the canal to green? So I think that's probably for Peter as well.
Yep, thanks Ray, thanks Colin. So yeah, no, you're right. The maps we've shown are a little old. The information we'll be showing through our modifications to local plan will update those maps. And essentially, I mean, I guess similar to what Jan was showing in terms of what you do with the offside of the canal. So rather than having a large scale local park, it may be more nuanced greening there, things directly adjacent to the canal which support biodiversity, maybe a little bit of access, maybe helping to open up the canal in smaller spots to help maybe visitors and employees of Car Giant to get access to the canal.
So would that be an appropriate location for a new footbridge or to link those two things together?
I think, I mean, you need to look at how you would land that footbridge, what existing uses and structures are there, the cost of it as well, and not just landing it on the Car Giant side, but also on the southern side, because it's quite restricted in terms of the nature reserve, but also you have the railway sidings, the big Elizabeth line depot, which is there as well. But there is an existing footpath, or footbridge rather, by the nature reserve, which does go into Car Giant. I think it's not fully accessible, so you know that would definitely be something to look at, improving the accessibility of that bridge.
Fantastic. We have a further question from Helen Gaisley. I hope I pronounced your surname right, Helen. And Helen asked about the planning, the infrastructure for boaters. Is there any intention to provide electrical charging points with a view to increasing use of hybrid and electric motors as we move away from diesel? Very topical question.
A very relevant question.
Yeah,
it's definitely, for the moment, there's no specific plans in that sense. So we're still at the scoping stage. But we are in touch. There's a London-wide network of, I think it's called Eco Moorings. I think it's led by Camden. So we are part of that network, and we are liaising with them about sort of the possibilities and also in terms of funding, because obviously that's something that's quite that comes with quite a cost. So yes, it's on our radar, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, I would just make a point, which I wasn't intending to plug Iwa Research Work, but it seems appropriate. There's a very interesting paper that was written in the last few months by an IWA member, and it's on the whole subject of sustainable boating, and it raises some very interesting points about the way in which this new methods of propulsion might be seen in the future. That is, of course, moving away gradually from diesel towards increased use of electric, and potentially, I think it's hydrogen. And the conclusion of this paper is that, of course, all the technology is there. It's not a question of new technology. The key point is infrastructure. And it would be very interesting to look at that and see how you think that would evolve and how that could be incorporated into the future plans.
Yeah. I mean, I would be interested in reading the paper, actually, if you could share
Fantastic. That. Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
But yeah, so that's also, I mean, that whole process of scoping to kind of find out what's the best program, the best kind of series of projects that we want to deliver along the canal, the most appropriate bulges facilities. That's basically what's happening now. So I think everyone who's interested in this should definitely reach out to us so we can have a conversation about that.
Yeah, be very pleased to do that.
There's a question from Trudy Anderson. She's a resident of Shaftesbury Gardens and Midland Terrace. And I'll summarize this a bit. She says one problem with walking on the towpath is the path is narrow, shared by both cyclists and walkers. It's quite dangerous, and it would be advantageous if there was a separate cyclist path so both cyclists and walkers could enjoy the canal. In other countries, she's seen floating cycleways built on the water for cyclists. I'm not sure we've got the width for that, but anyway, it looks like a boardwalk on the water. So are there any plans to separate cyclists and walkers' paths?
The issue is that there's simply not enough space along the canal to create two separate paths. And I think that's something Pete mentioned earlier, that we're working with different stakeholders like TfL to find alternative routes for cyclists. But it's not an easy exercise. In parallel, we do have conversations with the Canal and River Trust. So floating elements have been part of those discussions, but it's quite a complicated thing. Because for the very simple reason that any reduction of the navigable width of the canal needs central government approval. So anything we would put in the canal would basically have to go through central government, which is not a very simple procedure. And the Canal River Trust has the mission to maintain and preserve the canal at its current capacity. Yeah,
I think that there are all sorts of interested parties there that would want to comment. Carrying on with our questions, and also related to the point about cycling, Roger Stocker has asked the question. His question: given the large number of housing units in the development, how will many of the residents travel? You stated that you're looking at new cycle routes, but what thoughts have you to link the development to, say, Paddington?
In terms of, well, new routes to Paddington, that's where the cycle routes and cycleways planning with TfL comes in, because obviously TfL have a kind of a pan-London remit. We look after our patch. TfL part of the GLA family, so we work closely with them. So that would be kind of seeing where the demand is for people to get to different destinations, maybe different transport interchanges, trying to understand what the impact of COVID will be on long-term travel patterns as well. It's something which we're interested in. So I guess in terms of you know, how many will make use of those cycle routes, I mean, the mayor is very supportive of healthy, active travel, as well as delivery of green streets. So I think all of those things coming together is a general support for walking and cycling. It's just about helping to manage where those routes go and where they go to locally and regionally with our partners.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting situation. As you say, the London plan stressing the importance of active travel, which makes sense from so many points of view. I mean, we've in the responses that we've given over the last 3 years or so to various stages of the local plan, one of the things that I'm sure you know concerned us was this very broad aspect of, as you rightly mentioned, Pete, earlier, the overall expansion of development along the line of the canal. We could say from, you know, Greenford and further west right through to the future Kensal opportunity area and beyond. And one of the conclusions or concerns we came to, in addition to the things that have just been mentioned, was obviously it's really important to preserve the actual character of the canal, and all sorts of improvements and alterations could be considered, but that is a very important element, which I know that CRT, Canal and River Trust, are very concerned about. And I really do agree with your point about the importance of other cycle routes on the east-west route, and it would be very interesting to see how the modelling is done to show what kind of demand is anticipated over the next 5, 10, 20 years, and how those other routes could hopefully reduce the impact on the towpath.
Yeah.
You know, how those, to come to a specific question, how actually are those things modelled? Do you know, Pete? Does TfL lead on that?
It varies. So I think in the past, we have our public realm walking and cycling strategy, which is a few years old now, but it has the ethos of improving connectivity across the OPDC area. That was done for us externally by consultants, but TfL also do modelling for us as well. So I've had to look underneath the bonnet of the modelling systems which they use, and it's very complex in terms of mathematical equations and all that sort of thing. So
please don't mention the word algorithm.
No, I don't think it is. I think it is. It's human controlled. So, but what we essentially do with them is we provide them with a broad location of where development is going to be and the quantum of development as well. And from that, they plug it into their model, and then some assumptions in terms of where destinations will be. And then that gives us a broad picture of where the routes could be located as well. I think that it then goes to the next level of understanding what the kind of the barriers and challenges are along certain streets, because there might be, you know, as we see along the towpath, there might be narrow streets where you can't deliver segregated cycle lanes. So there's all sorts of different factors which come into play for that. And I know it's incredibly complex given kind of London's organic nature. It's a lot simpler in kind of American planned cities. But yeah, they do try and do a good job of it, and I think we'll start seeing the fruit of it with some of the livable neighbourhoods funding that TfL were rolling out, and that then evolved into the street space funding, which they're delivering now as well as response to COVID as well. So you'll start seeing lots of projects falling out of that.
Fantastic.
There's a question from David Bruff. I think really probably for Jan. we used to have the Ellesdale floating classroom in West London, but we lost it when the funding for Groundwork Trust ran out. Could you see any potential for a project that brought floating classroom back to West London?
It's actually, it's part of the scoping work that we're doing. So it's something that we're looking at. But as you mentioned, funding is one of the issues. It's always easy to fund building or buying a boat, but the problem is that funding it on long-term operations and so on, that's the issue. And unfortunately, we're not set up to do that kind of funding. We can't really run nor fund that kind of infrastructure. What we can do and what we're trying to do is to look at possibilities to set up a community interest company or something similar that could eventually take on the management and operations of any such facilities if we were to deliver them. So there's sort of two parallel processes. On the one hand, looking at sort of what could work and what's useful to deliver in that area, and the other one is looking at how can we then actually get it sort of how can we organize a sort of the management and operational aspect of it on the long term. And that's why we've got the community workspace operator on board of this project. They will be doing that whole sort of business planning aspect of this. But yeah, that's definitely something that that we've also been looking at.
Another question from Roger Stocker. His question is, will there be any investigations to see if a new canal basin is feasible within the development, something like Engineers Wharf in Southall? Do you have any opinions on that or views on how that might be considered?
We've the local plan supports additional basins and additional spaces. There's actually, I think it's an old coal wharf which was filled in God knows when, but you can see it when it's the canal slightly widens in the east on the car giant site, and that that could be interesting. But I guess the big challenge is viability in terms of the cost for it, and not just having tokenistic basins. We've seen them kind of in stuff around Wapping where you get one very shallow basin which is no good to man nor beast there. So I think if it was to be delivered, it has to be something which would be suitably designed and deliverable, but in theory we would support it.
Good, that's really good to hear. I mean, it would be great to see, I think, an extension of the canal and additional mooring space. There's different models of mooring, but I think it'd be very interesting to explore that, considering the scope of what you're doing. Another question. Roger Stocker has been very active. Any thoughts on residential moorings offside along the section of canal that borders the potential development? I don't know how exactly you're looking at the options for future moorings, or whether this is well, I guess there's of course a number of stakeholders involved, but be interested in your views on future residential and other types of moorings.
I mean, from a planning policy perspective and general planning perspective, we're quite agnostic about it. I think so long as there's sufficient access and amenities, i.e. electricity, water, all the sort of things which come with a residential mooring, if that's available and deliverable, then yeah, no problem with that.
Yeah, same. But that's obviously one of the reasons why we're quite keen on making sure that there's sufficient facilities for boaters in the area, because we expect there to be more activity in the future, and we need to make sure that they can actually that activity is supported. The whole creation of additional moorings obviously is also discussion to be had with the Canal and River Trust. Yes, I think having residential moorings in the area it really is an asset for the area, even in an industrial setting like Park Royal.
Yes.
because it does create a kind of a overlooking and sort of social control, which will make people feel safer and will make the canal slightly more pleasant to use.
Fantastic.
Peter, Mike Newman raises a point. He says, could you say something about the implementation timescales for the improvements described? And I suppose that's down also to some of the smaller interventions that Jan mentioned.
Yeah. So most of the projects I mentioned are, well, they have already started. So we're working on them. They're either in sort of early scoping stage, or as I mentioned, the Towpath ramp at Old Oak Lane, which is currently going through planning. So we're looking at, I think we'd be starting on the ground sort of spring 2021. Yeah, so most of the projects that have started have sort of a limited time span within which we need to spend the money. So they need to be delivered on site by March 2022. So that's quite quickly. The other projects, such as Marisequel Gardens, for example, they haven't started yet because we haven't secured funding for them. But as soon as we secure funding, we can actually get started with them. So we're kind of hoping that development will bring in the kind of funding that we need, also for Marisequel Gardens, for example, to get started. But I have to say that the projects that are in the canal placemaking study, they're not actual projects, they're more like case studies that kind of demonstrate how different strategies kind of play out in one specific location. But we use that to develop new projects and to apply for funding and so on. So don't take the sort of the projects in that document too serious, because they're more sort of illustrations of what could happen rather than actual projects that we will deliver.
On that, there was another question. Sorry, I'm trying to look for it, which was about the work at Harsden, the workspaces at Harsden. And Elise says, what's the community project website mentioned at Harsden, please?
How should I share that? Should I just drop that in the
Could
chat?
you put it in the chat box, then Elise?
Yes, I just need to look it up. I don't know it by heart. There it is.
While we do that,
there it is.
Of my own, there has been probably a loss of developable land for residential use, particularly in Old Oak. And I've heard talk of, horrible word, densification in commercial and industrial uses in Park Royal. And do you see that happening along the canal, or would that be something that will be kept away from the canal area? I think that's for Peter, probably.
Sorry, are you talking about the kind of increased floor space of industrial uses?
Well, yeah, and a need to find sites within Park Royal, perhaps, for other uses other than employment use, because the amount of land available for housing in Old Oak has probably in the shorter term kind of decreased.
Yep. So with the removal of site allocations that we were directed to do from Old Oak North, we are looking at other locations for the delivery of housing. We have our 10-year housing target set by the mayor, which we have to meet. So we're currently going through that process. What I would say is that wouldn't necessarily involve incredible densities coming forward. The densities coming forward that you would see on those sites is things that you would have seen or is in the local plan already in terms of the scale and massing, just maybe in different locations for it. In terms of the commercial and industrial uses, so we we would support delivery of increased floor space across Park Royal, but it would need to be mindful of the existing character of the canal, its role as an open space, its environmental, ecological roles, and its role as a conservation area as well. So we would look at each application in turn, and we have the policies, which I showed at the start, to look at each on kind of on a case by case basis. But what we don't want to do is to deliver kind of development that, one, doesn't accord with our policies, but two, would frustrate the delivery of Jan's projects as well along the canal, because I would imagine there's quite a few which will be happening along in the Park Royal stretch there. So, you know, there will be densification. That is a rather horrible word within Park Royal itself. It might be on the canal. If it has to be on the canal, then we would make sure it's very well designed and fits in with the principles that we're establishing for the canal.
And just, if I could just pick up on that, I think, I mean, there are some, developing along the canal can also help us in delivering some of the ambitions that we have. If we talk about boater infrastructure, a really useful way to pay for that is through development, and we can imagine bin storage, sewage access, and so on provided by private development, for example. So I think we would definitely try to make sure that whatever happens along the canal kind of is in line with also the ambitions that we have for the canal.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time. Perhaps that we have time, I think, for one or two more questions. Phil Emery asked an intriguing question. To what extent is your team finding the detailed design development relating to specific places, such as Old Oak Lane, an opportunity to rehearse the stakeholder issues and the feasibility of the emerging vision?
That's a really good question.
That's a very interesting question. Maybe that's one you want to ponder.
I think it provides an opportunity for discussions to be had. And I guess it kind of depends where the locations are, because we have an overarching vision, but there's so many different kind of character areas and so much potential across the area that those discussions would differ from place to place.
And I think, I mean, I wouldn't call it an emerging vision. I think we have the vision, and now it's more about actually fine-tuning that, and that's what's basically happening through those projects on the ground. And there are certain projects where there is a lot of room for discussion because of the nature of those projects. There's other projects such as the Towpath ramp, for example, which is quite infrastructural, which doesn't mean that there's no room for discussion, but it's more difficult to engage on that with a wide audience. But I think in general, we had a really good experience. I hope everyone agrees with the engagement on the canal placemaking study. And I think that really sort of set the tone for how we would like to engage with people in the future. And we were trying to sort of draw on that to make sure that everyone who wants to have a say on how those projects materialize on the ground can do so.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think probably final question, again, Roger Stocker. Very important point. Is there an update on the proposed HS2 station in the area linking the overground lines and Crossrail? Of course, you know, this is, I guess, is the reason for the entire concept of OPDC and the importance given to it. So how do you see that progressing in your relation to that important transport hub?
I mean, it's still going ahead. I think it's opening a bit later than originally intended. So I think it's 2029. I think is when it's opening, and they might have a kind of a staged approach with its relationship to Euston as well, being a terminus. So we're carrying on. High Speed 2 will open at Old Oak Common. It will have the interchange with Elizabeth Line. So we have to factor in changes in phasing into our longer term planning. So yeah, so it's still going ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think we'll, with looking at the clock, I think we'll have to end the questions there. But what I would say is that I apologise if there are some questions which are either not answered or not fully answered. At the top of the Q&A box, I've put my email address, and I would be very happy if anybody would like to send me an email and raise questions. And I assure you that we will do our best to coordinate with Jan and Pete to try to answer them following this webinar, or indeed you may think of additional questions you'd like to ask. We're delighted to do that. So please don't think that we're intentionally trying to avoid anything. Please feel free to ask questions and we'll do our best to answer. Jan and Pete, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your input. I would just repeat the comment that I made at the beginning, that I've been involved in planning processes the last, I don't know, 30, 40 years, mostly in other European countries. And from what I've seen of OPDC's efforts is really quite incredible. The amount of effort that's been put into communicating, informing all of the interested parties of what's going on in clearly a very complex and very large scale level is really very, very encouraging. And I'd like to offer our congratulations to you and your teams.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ray.
Could I thank everybody for their questions and hand back to Libby to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I add my thanks to our two speakers? It's been a really interesting evening, and I think the number of questions indicates that a great deal. So thank you both so much. A lot of canal users and boaters get nervous about new developments and feel that they might just turn their backs on the canal, but I think you've proved that you're doing exactly the opposite. And I think that's wonderful. And I hope people are encouraged by that. There's lots of exciting ideas and plans, and I'm sure we all look forward to watching how those progress. So thank you. And thank you too to Roger and Ray from West London branch for having liaised with OPDC and for working with them and have made this evening happen, because it's through you that we've been able to have this evening, through the two of you.
Thank you.
And Roger has already reminded you that if you've got any other questions, it's actually the chat box, not the Q&A box, if you're hunting the Q&A box. So if you're looking for Roger's email, it's in the chat box.
Oh, I apologise.
That's all right. And I'm just adding to the chat box the link for next month's, there we go, next month's social. So that's the next webinar we're having for London Region is on Monday, the 26th of October. And we're having a talk from Tim Lewis, who not only is a chairman of our North and East London branch, but is leader of the London Waterway Recovery Group, which many of you may know goes out at weekends and digs out derelict canals and so forth. Normally they go out for about 14 weekends per year, but this year, of course, it's been very different. They've only been able to do 3 or 4. But Tim will be giving us examples of varying projects in which the London Word people get involved, from scrub bashing and playing Hunt the Canal and finding out where it actually originally ran, through being able to access when you found where it is, whether you can actually get to it, right the way through to full restoration of canals. So I encourage you to take part in that, and you can, that link will take you to the place on the IWA website where you can register. And so good night to you all. Thank you for coming. Thank you for all your questions, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you. Good night.